UnMetal is a top-down stealth action comedy game that manages to both be a parody of Metal Gear Solid and actually manages to be a damn fun video game with just a few hiccups along the way. Here's why. To call something like UnMetal a Metal Gear parody is both an understatement and an oversimplification. At first glance, it looks like a port of Metal Gear 2 for the MSX, very intentionally evoking the same art design, level design, and setting. You play as Jesse Fox, a grizzled, combat-ready, Solid Snakey civilian who somehow ends up in a military prison for a crime he didn't commit, whose only goal is to go home but keeps getting dragged deeper and deeper into some evil plot by renegade commandos. And in order to survive his journey, he'll have to MacGyver the living hell out of whatever he can get a hold of. You often need to obtain items you can piece together to solve puzzles, clear obstacles, or use just to navigate to the next point of interest. The feel of the game is very much Metal Gear 2, but the moment-to-moment gameplay feels far more refined and intuitive than that. Arguably more so than Metal Gear Solid 1, in fact. It consists of venturing through dozens upon dozens of different corridors. And whereas with MGS you're usually advised to bypass whatever guards you encounter, in UnMetal your desired objective is always to silently neutralize any guard you come across. Not only does this prevent a wave of soldiers from entering the fray and tearing you a new one, but each enemy you silently take down earns you experience points. It's through experience points that you constantly level up, getting to pick and choose different skills to unlock up till a cap at level 10. It's a system that genuinely succeeds in doing what games like MGS 1 and 2 often struggle to do. Each corridor designed actually feels like a small puzzle, wherein your goal is always to try and figure out how you can silently neutralize enemies safely and quietly, often without any one glaringly obvious answer, since you don't have any consequence-free weapons like a tranq gun. Now in truth, I do prefer rewards coming from bypassing enemies instead of neutralizing them, simply because in games like Ghost Babel or Phantom Pain, it makes the level design feel a lot more engaging, using it to navigate around bad guys, on top of having the option to go the route UnMetal does. But I didn't mind it in this case because the level design does complement the pick them off one by one approach quite beautifully. As a matter of fact, it often tends to provide just enough cover to let you nab somebody mid-patrol and drag them out of sight before his buddy can even notice. And clutch moves like that are never not awesome. That's what I mean when I say UnMetal being a Metal Gear parody is a gross oversimplification, because it's so much more than that. It evokes feelings of Metal Gear, but has such tightly tailored mechanics that it manages to also evoke its own, wholly unique gameplay loop on top of that. And for the most part, the pacing is so brisk that even the more binary or often samey level design can easily be overlooked at just how fast you're chugging along throughout the game. What sets UnMetal above any other parody game I've ever played or heard of is that while the humor is front and center, the central focus is still on tightly crafted gameplay first and foremost. For example, there's a set piece in the second chapter where you're chased around by mutant squirrels, while Jesse imagines himself as a giant acorn and Benny Hill music starts playing. Now that's hilarious, it's idiotic and absurd and I love it, but it doesn't end at just the gag of ha ha ha, giant acorn getting chased by squirrels is funny. It's a genuinely tense and challenging set piece because these asshole squirrels don't let up, and if you aren't careful you'll die pretty quickly. Towards the end of that same level, there's a boss fight against a giant pile of garbage because Jesse's trying to make his story more interesting. It's absurd, and yet it's also an incredibly challenging and very entertaining boss battle. This is a parody game that doesn't forget the whole game part of that subgenre, and the end result is every bit as entertaining as the demo I played last year made me think it would be. The game has 10 chapters in total, all about as long as they need to be, heavy with stealth action gameplay in each one, mixed with the right amount of puzzles and environmental challenges and at least one boss fight per chapter, sometimes two bosses. The end result is a game that mostly moves at a steady pace, providing plenty of entertaining stealth action with mostly entertaining set pieces and new challenges within each chapter to deal with. One chapter has insta-kill shredders with mutant fish, another has 8-man platoons constantly patrolling the barracks, forcing you to always have to be quick with your actions, lest you end up dragging a guard away as the squad's running into frame, and another features total stealth. The game constantly finds clever ways to force you to use your inventory to get through environmental challenges in ways that can often feel very challenging, but almost never feels unfair or unmanageable. And this is a big part of where the whole parody side of things really complements the gameplay. See, in my impressions video, I expressed apprehension but cautious optimism about the way the game's framing was handled. Jesse's being interrogated, so the entire journey is being told in an after-the-fact recollection from the man. And as we later learn, that interrogation is also happening after the fact, as Jesse's telling the whole thing to a smuggler partner, more on that later. Everything has already occurred, and we're dealing with an unreliable narrator who's kind of an idiot. As a result, the game manages to use that framing in really clever ways in-game, which creates new experiences great for replays. One of the last chapters actually lets you decide what kind of guards you'd be encountering, Scandinavians or Terminators. a silly visual gag with genuinely interesting gameplay challenges, because you can either deal with guards who are much stronger and now wake up after you knock them out after a while, limiting how long you're actually safe around them, or you can take on much stronger robots who can't be knocked out but can now be killed freely with heavier weapons. A lesser game would just leave it at the gag, but gags alone don't carry a video game. And the guys at UnMetal Fran understand that, instead creating a gameplay loop that manages to be funny, challenging, and very entertaining. I mean, it's not the most deeply engrossing, versatile of gameplay loops out there, but one that provides a consistently enjoyable run to chug through, whilst providing just enough uniqueness in each chapter to keep things from ever feeling stale or repetitive, be it with the enemies, environments, new stipulations, and especially the boss fights. More on that later. Now, that isn't to say the campaign is perfect. For the most part, it's a very fun game to blaze through, but there are quite a few hiccups here and there. For starters, some sequences can be incredibly tedious. This being a Metal Gear parody, of course there's gonna be a sequence where you gotta cross a minefield. It wasn't fun in Metal Gear, and unfortunately it's even less fun here. In MGS, you had to crawl on the ground to bypass claymores. It slows things down but isn't super unmanageable. But in this game, you have to actively use a mine detector to seek out each individual mine constantly, basically taking one step, seeking out mines, and taking another step onward. And if you hit one once, you die automatically and have to do that all over again. There's also the fucking goddamn labyrinth. Towards the end of the game, to reach the final boss's lair, you need to traverse an ancient underground labyrinth full of ghosts and pitfalls that's impossible to navigate without a map. Now, the team really did a good job of making the labyrinth feel genuinely disorienting and difficult to navigate even with a map, and I give them full marks for that. Problem is, it's not fun having to constantly check a map each and every time you hit a fork in the road, and dying instantly if you take one wrong turn, or having ghosts that you can't shake off who will kill you if they latch onto you. I mean, it's not unreasonable, the game's load times are instant, and you do steadily locate more portable potties, which let you quick save anywhere so long as you still have spares, but the stop and go nature of this sequence, combined with how long it is, just grates way too goddamn much. And this is an indie game, so of course you're gonna have bugs here and there.
I noticed a few abandoned crates that were thirsty. They seemed easy to reach. That is, until the containers started to drop.
This stuff is mainly just mildly distracting more than anything else. I never encountered any crashes or game-breaking bugs, though I did learn not to hide Scandinavians in the toilet because when you load, they'll be awake and alerted instantly if you do. Really, the biggest issue with this game, and a great source of frustration I tended to find, was the simple fact that this game gets really brutal towards the second half. For example, one boss fight is a speedboat chase against an attack chopper. The chopper itself is evasive enough that actually landing hits on it is a challenge. On top of that, the chopper is constantly dropping bombs and attack patterns that become increasingly more difficult to evade. You gotta chase after a speeding chopper that's constantly moving and dropping bombs that you have to avoid because getting hit twice will kill you instantly, and that's on normal difficulty. I'd personally say that's already asking a lot from the player, especially since you're constantly moving anyway. But nope. This fight goes one extra step further and insta-kills you if you hit the sides of the river once. And it takes a good few hits to take this chopper down. So you gotta constantly watch the river to make sure you avoid hitting the walls and dying immediately, all while swerving through increasingly tighter and wavier passages to avoid the chopper's attacks, while also trying to land a hit on a chopper in the middle of all of this. This game really doesn't hold your hand. You either keep up or it will kick your ass again and again. I mean, even some of the dialogue trees can feel excessively cheap. One of the game's quote-unquote boss fights is really just a dialogue tree against a drill sergeant. And to beat him, you essentially gotta choose the right dialogue options that will make him cry. Trouble is, any incorrect options will result in instant death because your interrogators will say you're lying to them and kill you for it. There's another puzzle towards the last act of the game that requires you to trick your way into getting inside the base. And doing so requires tricking the gatekeeper into thinking you're a pizza guy by getting a pizza box from a trash can and making it steamy with a fire extinguisher so the guy doesn't think it's cold. Every other option will either get you killed or result in the guy telling you to go away. And while you're usually trained by that point to use whatever's in your environment to progress, the problem here is that the game suddenly decides that now, fire extinguishers and trash cans can be interacted with when all game long they couldn't be. So then why am I suddenly expected to try searching items the game's already conditioned me, the player, are nothing but non-interactive background assets? That's one thing this game does way too damn much. There's a lot of puzzles and dialogue trees that will drag on even when you've already made the wrong decision and will end up dead regardless. That's just not the kind of trial and error dicking about I've ever liked with these games. Now the good news is with UnMetal, there's always a save point right before these kinds of puzzles. So it's not even like the game's dicking you about too much and setting you back, but it does still waste your time. And for a game that's mostly really good at moving along nicely, those sorts of things can grind things down to a crawl in the worst possible way. UnMetal mostly does a good job of navigating around that stuff. portable potties to do quick saves and long stretches of gameplay without autosaves or bathroom saves, binoculars that let you see the next room and guard placement before you enter, and the option to change difficulties at any time. It just could have used a little bit more balancing and maybe a few more accessibility options. Finally, another issue that kinda hurts a game long term for me is the lack of New Game Plus. Once you beat the game, that's your lot. You can replay any chapter you wish in the chapter select category, which is great. Trouble is, you can't carry over all the gear and upgrades you got up to that point. It's more like wherever you were at that point of the game more than anything else. And by chapter 10, you'll only have accessed half the skills in the game, since with each upgrade you have to pick and choose which skills you want, with the one you don't choose never coming back for future level ups. So it seems like a pretty big missed opportunity, not letting us replay the full game with all of our skills and portable potties, and getting to try out some of the other skills we skipped over for some mix and match customization. Because with the skill sets like UnMetal's, there are just too many skills that have more inherent worth than others, which makes me think that some skills should have just been the default, like the rapid-fire melee attacks or faster rolling. It's different with games like Metal Gear because when you replay those games, you play about as well as you did from the start. But by chapter 10 of UnMetal, you feel the difference in how Jesse Fox plays. So it can dampen the replay value just a bit knowing just how finely tuned Jesse can actually play later on. But not by much because the game is still really replayable due to just how accessible it is. I'm sure there's a bunch of other issues, but none of them are ultimately deal breakers. Nor does it change the fact that I was completely hooked playing this game the moment I started up. Though it may be a parody game, it actually kind of exceeds the blueprint of what I've come to expect from good Metal Gear games. It's got a hefty amount of varied yet consistent gameplay. Its detractions, while annoying, don't eat up too much of the game's 9 to 10 hour long campaign. Best yet, the game doesn't skip out on the boss fights either. UnMetal throws a ton of boss fights at you, usually to punctuate the end of a chapter, other times to conclude a certain subsection of a level, and each one is always a highlight. The fights are all mechanically diverse, with each boss having entirely different attacks from the last. Some require different strategies for defeating them, others are actually pretty open-ended, but almost every single one does what a truly great boss fight is supposed to do. Feels like a test of your skills and a reward at the exact same time. Most can be cleared in like a minute or less, but these are all the types of bosses where they may go down fast, but you can go down even faster if you aren't careful. You had a really nice mix of conventional fights and more outlandish bosses and vehicle fights. Not a single one is a breeze, yet minus the helicopter, each one still feels manageable, which makes them all the more entertaining as a result. Is it comical and absurd for a main villain to have a random samurai as an enforcer? Sure, but if it makes for a really fun boss fight, who the hell cares? Like Metal Gear, a lot of the fights really manage to feel more outside the box, but never feels clunky or like a chore to get through. I was always excited for the next boss because I knew it would be completely different from the last, and usually really fun. Some bosses are designed to be a bit more hectic, where if you don't kill them as fast as you can, you're pretty much already dead, and the giant freak in the Ol was pretty straightforward as far as bosses go, but by and large, each one was a knockout. Nothing amazing, but always hard and fun without ever feeling repetitive or grindy, and the fact that there are so many of them means that things are constantly shaking up in the best way possible. And upon looking back at the game as a whole, I'm kind of astounded. This is a game you can now pick up on Steam, PS4, and the Switch for $19.99, 1/3 the price of any AAA title you'll play once and never think about ever again. And for 1/3 of that price, you get a game that feels great to play, has a pretty meaty campaign that doesn't overstay its welcome, alternate in-game options that are great for replays, has mostly great set pieces and environmental challenges, and tons of boss fights to go through. Like, if you were to ask me what I truly seek in a great video game, I'd point to everything UnMetal does and say, that. UnMetal not only scratches that Metal Gear itch I've been craving ever since Phantom Pain, but it's just a damn good video game that's really easy to pick up and play at your leisure. So with all that said, how does the writing and whole comedy side of things fare? Well, surprisingly well for the most part.
I had to orient myself somehow or I'd end up spending 30 years in that maze of trees. I tried to direct myself by watching the stars, but the damn top-down view only let me see the trees and ground.
The premise is Jesse Fox has somehow ended up captured by a crack squad of soldiers for a crime he didn't commit, and now has to use his outside-the-box cunning to find a way home. And the more he tries to get away from this whole mess, the more he keeps stumbling upon a larger and larger plot called Operation Jericho, being carried out by the villainous General X. Jesse's no solid snake though, so his only goal is to try and get out of Dodge and call the cavalry in so they can take care of Gen X and snuff out his master plan to use nuclear submarines to commit mass genocide because he's an asshole. If I could describe UnMetal's story in one sentence, it would be being Naked Gun but Metal Gear. The whole feel of the game is very tongue-in-cheek, but it still plays the story straight in a B-movie action kind of way. Nothing thought-provoking or compelling, just the narrative glue needed to justify all the lunacy. Lunacy made even better by the fact that our narrator, Jesse Fox, is about as reliable as an HR department within a big AAA publisher. He's an over-the-top caricature of Solid Snake, all grizzle and paranoia. The perfect idiot protagonist for this perfect idiot story, and I say that as a compliment. I said the game reminded me of Naked Gun because it has a very similar disposition in its writing, characterization, and comedy most of the time. It remains completely straight-faced, even in the most outlandish of moments, often avoiding the trap most parodies fall under, where they constantly feel the need to have to point out every little absurdity to the point where it loses all humor. The framing device of this all happening from Jesse's perspective means the game can get away with a lot of crazy crap, but also have a lot of really great recurring gags. Like how Jesse can't remember anyone's name, so literally every single guard and even one of the boss fights is just called Mike. Or how there's random monsters and hidden dungeons on a military base because the story is being retold by an embellishing moron. And having played through the campaign, I will happily admit that I burst out laughing a number of times throughout the game.
Hold on, you have expertise in chemistry?
Chemistry's not that hard. You just have to mix the ingredients correctly.
And the way a lot of in-game choices can have completely unexpected results tends to get a good laugh out of me. Like here when I saved the doctor.
Wait, what?
Ouch! Deja vu.
What the hell were you doing?
I was leaning in for a hug.
With your eyes closed? And you said kiss out loud.
And the biggest source of comedy comes from Jesse himself. Between his absurd inner monologue, the reactions he tends to evoke from other people, and the fact that his paranoia veers into the hilariously illogical, Jesse's just a highly entertaining protagonist. A walking boob with no social skills but a seemingly good heart despite his idiocy, and the occasional spark of impressive brilliance. It's the fact that the story takes itself seriously enough, and all the other characters take it just as seriously, that makes this idiot shine even better. Humor usually doesn't work if everyone's trying to be the quirky funny one, and that tends to be emphasized by some of the more one-off characters who come and go. The drill sergeant boss, for example, is very clearly meant to be Sergeant Hartman from Full Metal Jacket, and that whole shtick just kind of felt flat for me. It wasn't really all that clever, just pointing at the character and saying, hey, remember Full Metal Jacket? I mean, let's be honest, with any comedy, not every joke is gonna land, and there's plenty of jokes in this game that just kind of felt flat. But that's not really the game's fault, so much as it is humor being entirely subjective. That said, however, I do have to make a note about the voice acting in this game, because I don't think it's subjective to say that it kind of sounds amateurish. A lot of the actors are pretty solid, but the inflection on some of their reads just sound like they weren't being directed at all.
Man, these pictures leave a lot to be desired. Did you take them with one of those disposable cardboard cameras?
You're such an ass.
Only the smartest of them.
Half the bosses just sound like some guy doing a very unconvincing voice.
You has won. You show great courage in combat. To fight you has been great honor. Sayonara.
Hasta la vista, baby.
Still, for what it is, the story does entertain while actually managing to build something resembling intrigue along the way. Nothing super involving, but enough of a threat that it genuinely feels like there are real stakes in this parody game. Or maybe the entire story was one giant lie that Jesse told his partner to seem sexy enough to want to shag? The point being, it all comes together nicely and creates a thoroughly satisfying whole. It's Metal Gear with enough self-awareness to realize how absurd Metal Gear truly is, without just poking fun at it the whole time. Mostly. In the end, UnMetal may have come out a full year later than expected, but man is this game worth it. It may be deeply flawed in some key areas, but there's so much good to outweigh the bad that it more than makes up for it. UnMetal has everything I could ask for from a video game. A brisk and enjoyable core gameplay loop that's incredibly easy to just pick up and play. A campaign that's long enough to feel like you're getting your money's worth without ever feeling like it's dragging on. The right amount of set pieces and environmental hazards, enough variation within the skills and in-game choices to provide a healthy amount of variation for subsequent replays, a whole slew of unique and entertaining boss fights that are always just around the corner, and all of it for the low price of $19.99. Whether you're a Metal Gear fan jonesing for a taste of that old-fashioned sneaky shooty goodness, or just looking for a fun game to pick up and play, UnMetal delivers in spades. Just as I said 1 year ago when I played the demo, this may not technically be Metal Gear, but UnMetal is damn solid. And so my final rating for UnMetal is an 8 out of 10. There's plenty of room for improvement, but the end result was still a game I plowed through in a matter of days. Even at its most frustrating, at no point was it ever a chore to play. And God only knows that's getting harder and harder to say about most games being released these days. Which further illustrates the significance of not sitting on indie titles, because something like UnMetal can come along and knock your cardboard box socks clean off. Have you played UnMetal? If so, what are your thoughts? How does this game compare to Metal Gear or just a conventional video game? Are there any other indie games you're really excited about? Whatever your thoughts, whether you agree or disagree, let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching. Also, it kind of says something when the parody of Metal Gear 2 features mutant squirrels, and that's still somehow not as absurd as what we got in the original game. God, I wish there was a gerbil launcher in Phantom Pain.